Imagine walking into the LSAT in June feeling totally confident, only to see brand new question formats that throw you off your game. Panic sets in, you realize you didn't prepare for the shift toward formal logic questions. If that sounds like a nightmare scenario, let's make sure this doesn't happen to you. First, for those who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005, and I personally increased my own LSAT score from a 152 to a 175. Now, over the past year and a half or so, I've seen how LSAT is subtly, but significantly, changing the test. And knowing these changes are crucial if you're aiming to take the LSAT in June or beyond. My goal today is to share everything I know about these changes so you can update your LSAT study plan accordingly and walk into the June LSAT feeling calm, collected, and confident. Now, before I dive into the specifics, let me address a question I get all the time. Why should you trust these predictions? Well, here's what's been happening in the LSAT world. Countless students have been coming back to me and other LSAT experts sharing that they're seeing an increased frequency of questions testing formal logic, numbers versus percentages, and conditional reasoning concepts. These new question patterns aren't anecdotal, they're actually being reported at scale. And the unscored extra sections on recent LSATs have been loaded with new variations of formal logic questions. Historically, LSAC has used that extra section to field test questions that may become more prominent on the scored sections in the future, and this is exactly what we're seeing right now. Of course, LSAC removed the logic game section due to a legal settlement, but they still want to test your ability to handle structured, logic-heavy thinking. Just now, it's being shifted heavily into logical reasoning. And if you don't adapt, you could easily get blindsided. So, if your LSAT date is June or beyond, consider this your heads up. Now, let's get into the specifics of what's changing and how you can outsmart these changes. Now, over the past year, we've seen a whole lot more formal logic questions in the logical reasoning section, including complex conditionals, where you have multiple if-then statements chained together, more questions involving numbers versus percentages that contain important distinctions between absolute numbers and proportional statements, as well as more questions that have rules that interlock, requiring careful diagramming to solve quickly. Of course, you saw this kind of reasoning appearing predominantly in the logic game section and only occasionally in logical reasoning. But now, with the logic game section removed, LSAC is taking that same skill set and sprinkling it throughout the logical reasoning section. And so, if you're the kind of student who skips advanced logic concepts when you're studying, figuring, I'll just wing it or memorize some basic rules, that approach might have worked for you years back, but it's not going to cut it today. The proportion of these tricky logic-based questions is climbing. So today, I'll walk you through the core strategies and best practices I recommend for mastering these new LSAT question trends. If you've got a pen and paper handy, take notes. This could save you weeks of trial and error. First, you want to refine your diagramming skills, your ability to interpret formal logic. People sometimes worry that diagramming will slow them down, but in reality, if you practice diagramming enough, it becomes second nature and can actually speed you up on more complex questions. Diagramming also reduces mistakes by giving you a visual map of the argument, but you've got to use clear symbols and be consistent, using arrows, using single letters as variables, and taking contrapositive. And you've got to practice repeatedly. You want to do so many of these diagrams during your practice tests that they become second nature and muscle memory by test day itself, so you can whip up a quick, accurate diagram in seconds. You also want to do a deep dive into numbers versus percentages. A big pitfall here is to assume that a higher percentage automatically means a higher absolute number, or vice versa. LSAC loves to exploit this confusion. So, whenever you see statements like 80% of group X or 20% more than last year, pause and ask yourself, does this require a proportional shift or an absolute difference? That single question can clarify the entire logic of the argument. You also want to practice on previous LSAT questions that specifically test that numbers versus percentages concept. A classic example is the Prep Test 117 question about Clara Schumann. You want to take a close look at how the question is structured and what the answer hinges upon. You also want to master inference questions like must be true, and most strongly supported. Those are one of the most common question types on the LSAT, and formal logic is often heavily embedded here. For example, there's a great question from Prep Test 111 about inspired musical performances, loaded with conditional statements, perfect for practicing diagramming. There's also a great sufficient assumption question in Prep Test 130 about handmade wigs, lots of formal logic going on there. Now, here's a tip to help you get more efficient at evaluating stimuli like these. First, you want to identify the relationships. Before you even get into the answer choices, look at the relationships within the stimulus, and if you see multiple conditionals, connect them visually, then try to predict the answer. Anticipate logically what must or will most likely follow from those statements. That way, the correct answer will jump out at you. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, okay, that's a lot of information. And yes, it is, but you don't have to figure it out all by yourself. At LSAT Unplugged, we offer private one-on-one coaching and small group classes specifically tailored to the new LSAT and all these recent changes, giving you detailed breakdowns of formal logic and conditional reasoning, extra drills for numbers and percentages questions. And so if you want to cut the learning curve and study with someone who's helped countless students jump 10, 20, even 30 points or more, check out the links below to book a call with me and my team. We'll talk through your goals, your current score range, and figure out how you can maximize your potential come test day. Don't let these new trends hold you back from getting into a top law school and scoring 170 plus on the LSAT. Now let's talk through some common mistakes students encounter when navigating these changes. The biggest one is probably rushing through formal logic. A lot of students will skip diagramming because it feels dry or time-consuming, but that's a huge mistake. You want to slow down and master the fundamentals. Practice them every single day. Drill them if you have to. The second big mistake is over-relying on old and outdated study materials. Many LSAT books from years back focus heavily on logic games and are light on advanced formal logic and logical reasoning. Instead, you want to seek out up-to-date materials that reflect the new test structure and personalized support to help you focus on these recent changes. The third big mistake is to neglect mastering inference questions. People think inference questions are straightforward, and yes, they can be, but they can also be incredibly tricky if you don't see the hidden relationships. So you want to identify all the premises, diagram or outline them, and then force yourself to articulate each possible conclusion. Now, one final mistake that students often make as well is to ignore timed practice. And that's a problem because, of course, you can know formal logic in theory, you can know how to diagram with unlimited time, but under timed conditions, when your adrenaline's pumping, it could be a different story. And so you want to do timed sections. Even if that involves just doing 5 or 6 formal logic questions in a row with the clock running, that'll at least get you a little bit closer to the real test environment. Now, the good news is, because these are real changes, ones that are going to throw some students off, the prepared test takers like you, if you follow this advice, can stand out and get a higher score. Most students are going to keep studying as if the LSAT never changed. They'll walk in on test day and wonder what happened to logic games, and they'll also wonder why they got hammered with advanced logic questions in logical reasoning. But you're going to be ready. The key is to start now. Don't wait till the last few weeks to tackle these question types. So that's the big picture of what you expect for the June LSAT and beyond. If there's one thing I want you to remember, it's this. The LSAT is evolving, and you need to evolve with it. Don't rely on outdated resources or minimal focus on formal logic. Instead, lean in to the new structure, double down on your study of conditionals, numbers, and diagramming strategies. And if you'd like individual guidance, personalized support, check out the links below to book a call with me and my team. We'll walk you through your personalized day-by-day study plan, whether you're aiming for a top 14 law school or just want to make a significant score jump, ideally into the 170s. We'd be glad to help. And in the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.